Susan's Bears by Mildred Lawrence. Susan was quite a big girl now, but she was afraid of bears. It was true that she had never seen any except the ones in the zoo, who were so good-natured that nobody could be afraid of them. But Susan was very much afraid of the bears she couldn't see, the ones that lived behind the upstairs hall door at Aunt Marian's house. Susan had never actually seen them, but she was sure they were there. But she was sure there were some there, because it was very cozy and exactly the spot any sensible bears would choose. "There aren't any bears there," Aunt Marian exclaimed the first time Susan came to stay all night with her. "Don't be silly." "Bears? Certainly we have bears." That was Cousin John, who was nearly as old as Susan's mama and daddy, in spite of being Aunt Marian's youngest boy. He was a doctor in the city, and Susan couldn't remember having seen him more than once or twice before. "There was a whole family of bears behind the hall door. I remember them distinctly. Nice bears, too." "How many?" Susan asked. "4, I believe," Cousin John said, thinking hard for a minute. "Mr. and Mrs. Bear and the twins, whose names I forget." Aunt Marian laughed a little, and Susan asked, "How do you know they're there?" "Well, how do you know?" said Cousin John asked. "They just are, that's all." "Don't scare the child," Aunt Marian said. "Just for a joke." "She isn't scared," said Cousin John, looking hard at Susan. "Yes, I am," said Susan. "I don't like bears, except the ones at the zoo." "These bears come from the zoo," Cousin John remarked. "They stay at the zoo in the day and come here at night. They like the hall here better than those chilly caves." "I should too," Susan said. "Are these really the bears from the zoo?" "I'm sure of it," Cousin John said firmly. But climbing the stairs to bed, Susan began to be afraid of the bears again. She hurried through the hall as fast as she could scamper and turned on the light in her room. Propped up against the mirror was a large white envelope with some rather wobbly printing on it. "To Susan," it said. Susan spread out the paper inside. "Dear Susan," she read, "we will not be behind the hall door tonight as we have gone to have our fur washed and curled. We are going to have ice cream sodas afterwards." It was signed, Mr. and Mrs. Bear, Buster, and Beulah. Susan was very much surprised. "Who would have thought that bears could write letters?" she said to herself. "I wonder how they can hold pencils in their shaggy paws." She wondered so hard about this that she was asleep before she knew it. When she saw Cousin John at breakfast the next morning, she told him all about the letter. He didn't seem much surprised. "That's what I told you," he said, turning another page in the morning paper. The next night, Susan hurried upstairs to bed. Partly she was afraid of the bears, and partly she wanted to see if there was another letter. At first she thought there wasn't, but finally, just as she was about to hop into bed, she found an envelope pinned to her pillow. "Dear Susan," She read, "We are all going to be sound asleep when you read this. Please do not disturb us, as we need our sleep after a busy day at the zoo. We are very glad you are visiting here, as it gets lonesome thinking we are all alone here every night." It was signed the 4 Bs. "Think of that," Susan said very softly, so as not to awaken the bears. "I never imagined that bears got lonesome too." She had to be so very quiet after she got into bed that she was asleep before she could even turn over. "Do you think they mind staying at the zoo in the daytime?" Susan asked Cousin John. "Maybe they would rather be here all the time." "Probably they would," Cousin John said, "but unless bears belong to somebody special, they have to stay at the zoo." "Well, I wish they belonged to me," Susan said, "because I'm not afraid of them anymore." She rushed upstairs as fast as she could that night. This time the envelope was pinned to Susan's chair. "Dear Susan," it said, "we like you very much and wish we could belong to you. The zoo is a nice place, but we would much rather live with you. If you would like to have us, look behind the hall door. We will be waiting for you." Susan hurried into the hall and peered behind the door. There, all in a row, sat 4 bears. 2 tiny ones, 1 bigger one, and one so big that he came nearly to Susan's elbow. For a minute, Susan imagined that they were real, live bears. "You darling things," she cried, gathering them up in her arms. "You may sleep with me tonight," Susan promised them. She tucked them all in so very carefully that she was asleep herself in less than a minute. In the morning, she brushed them all neatly and carried them down to breakfast. "Here is the bear family," she told Aunt Marian and Cousin John. "They got tired of the zoo and came to be my very own bears. Delighted, I'm sure," Cousin John said, putting down his paper and making a bow. Oh, Cousin John, Susan cried, hugging him with all her might. Thank you so much. I just loved my bears. I just love my bears, and wasn't I silly to be afraid? And that's the end.